Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's European Union side event as part of the COP27. This event will give an overview of the recently announced European Solar PV Industry Alliance. To introduce myself, my name is Jennifer Carle, and I'm working in the Green and Circular Economy Unit within the Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs at the European Commission. One of the visions of this COP27 is to advance further from negotiations to implementation through specific, measurable, and impactful initiatives that are delivered and implemented on the ground. In line with this ambition, the European Solar PV Industry Alliance is one of the concrete initiatives of the European Union Solar Energy Strategy, which was adopted earlier this year as part of the REPowerEU plan. The following presentation will place the Solar PV Industry Alliance in the policy context of the European Union, explain the industry challenges that the Alliance aims to tackle, and give an overview of the objectives and actions of the Alliance work. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this event, Jacek Trzynski. He is the Deputy Head for the Green and Circular Economy Unit within the Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMEs of the European Commission. Prior to that, he has worked on investment support schemes within the Economic and Financial Affairs Directorate General and on regulatory matters linked to energy efficiency and renewables within the Energy Directorate General of the Commission. Before joining the Commission, Jacek Trzynski worked as consultant on energy matters to various industry associations. Before I give the floor to Jacek, I would like to inform you that the first part of this event will be in form of a presentation from Jacek. We will then move on to the Q&As in the second part. If you have any questions that you would like to raise, feel free to put them in the Slido. You can now see the QR code for the Slido in the presentation that you can scan and then ask your questions in there. So with no further ado, I now pass over to Jacek.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, for your nice introduction. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Jennifer indicated, I will talk about this new industrial initiative that we are rolling out currently in the EU. So I will tell a few words about why we're doing this. I will also say then a couple of words about what it involves and what the next steps are. And indeed, I mean, I think probably the most interesting part would be an exchange with you and answering your questions and also hearing your comments. Right, so starting with the context here, you know that Europe has this big ambition to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And to make it happen, last year we have tabled a very comprehensive policy package, European Green Deal, Fit for 55. So Fit for 55, 55 corresponds to the level of greenhouse gas reduction that we want to achieve in 2030. What we also want to achieve in 2030 is a 45% share of renewables in the EU energy mix. Now, this has been increased recently, and that's part of the context, because when we tabled this last year, it was 40%, but what happened this year in February, Russia invaded Ukraine, and so we have seen what the risks are of not only relying on one partner for energy supplies, former partner, but also the risks of relying on fossil fuels. So one of the answers to this crisis situation from the EU has been an accelerated move towards greater decarbonization, increased ambition for renewables, and that was followed again by very specific proposals, notably to speed up permitting procedures for renewable projects, because what we see today in the EU, but I think everywhere in the world, is that it takes too much time to obtain your permit to develop new, be it renewable or wind projects. And here we talk mainly about utility scale, of course, projects. So right, so that's the overall context for the deployment. And part of that, of course, as I said, accelerated deployment is an accelerated deployment of PV and solar more broadly. And that's why we have also tabled earlier this year a strategy, so-called solar strategy, which aims to achieve 320 gigawatts of solar PV deployment by 2025, by yes, in 2025, and raising that to 600 gigawatts by 2030. And that's very ambitious if you compare it to the current level. That being said, we see already a significant acceleration of solar PV. For solar PV, the good thing is that we don't have the same constraints as for wind, because a lot of the projects are small-scale projects. So permitting is not such a break as for wind. So, you know, if there's one thing coming out of this dramatic situation in Ukraine, is that solar deployment in the EU is really accelerating. And that was already happening before the crisis. Actually, in 2020, I think it was like almost 20 gigawatts of solar were added to the energy mix in the EU. And that's really significant. And part of that accelerated deployment are concrete also proposals for public and commercial buildings to have mandatory requirements to install solar PV on the rooftops. And that's what you see here on the slide, the EU Solar Rooftop Initiative, which will mandate gradually first new buildings, new public buildings and commercial buildings to have solar PV rooftop, then residential buildings, and then also this obligation will apply gradually to existing buildings. So, you know, we are following with very concrete requirements our, let's say, political objectives. So that's really about deployment of renewables. And here, you know, the Solar PV Alliance is about supply. So how we match that additional demand that we want to target through those measures with additional supply, partly produced in the EU. And here I would just like to mention the fourth element you can see on this slide, which is in your right top corner, eco-design of sustainable products, forced labor. So, you know, when we talk about Europe, often we say that the US innovates and the EU regulates. And I think it's not entirely fair. I think we have also a lot of innovation in Europe, but we indeed are attached to a certain level of social and environmental standards. And that's why we want to ensure that the products that we put on the market in the EU meet those standards, irrespective of whether they are produced by EU manufacturers or whether they are imported from elsewhere. And that's why we are working on such standards, notably under the eco-design legislation. We are developing specific measures that will cover solar PV. So you can expect that as of next year, solar panels placed on the EU market will notably have to meet certain levels of embedded, maximum embedded carbon footprint. And second, forced labor, we want to ensure that products placed on the EU market are not made with forced labor, and that's irrespective, of course, of where they are made, or where they are made, or to what products they apply. This will be a horizontal measure applying to all products. Next slide, please. Right. So, no, previous slide still. With the circles, right? So here I would like to just now move to this narrower context, let's say, of the European Solar PV Industry Alliance. You can see here in these rounds a couple of key figures, let's say, that I would like to refer to. Starting with the left-hand side, where we are today in terms of the PV production in Europe. You might know that back in the 90s, Europe was the first to develop an industry for PV, for solar panels. Then it was shifted, let's say, gradually the production shifted to China. We still have certain parts of the value chain which are very developed in the EU, notably for polysilicon. So if you look at the value chain of solar panels, polysilicon, that's where you start, right? So there we still have 23 gigawatts of production in the EU, but that's one single manufacturer, and that of course also creates certain risks for stable supply. But then when you go downstream to the production of modules and the production of its components, such as wafers, ingots, and so on, there we have really small production in the EU. And that's really what we want to target. With the Solar Alliance, we want to develop the whole value chain, because that's really, if you want to develop an industry from scratch, in fact, you have to move simultaneously across all stages of the value chain. And, I think the key question here is why we want to do it. Of course, there is the aspect where we always say that climate policies are good for the economy, green growth. We have to show also to our citizens that there will be green jobs linked to this transition, to ensure that they support the policies that we are deploying. But also, the fact that we depend today for more than 90% of supply of solar PV on imports from China creates risks. And actually, we have seen the effects of those risks. And there's the third figure you can see here, 25%. That's the level of cancellations that we have seen last year of projects in the EU. Solar projects that simply were not able to access materials because there was COVID, because there were supply chain bottlenecks and so on. So that's the whole idea really is about increasing resilience, reducing risks, and so on. And the final element I would like to mention that you can see on this slide here, IRA, many associate that acronym with past history, but actually it now has a new meaning that stands for the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is a massive industrial development program that the US is currently deploying, almost 400 billion euros in subsidies for the production of hydrogen, batteries, wind equipment, but also solar PV. So what I want to say here is that we are basically moving to a reality where everyone wants to minimize the risks linked to an overdependence on certain key strategic materials for the energy transition. And of course, that creates opportunities to cooperate, but also it creates challenges because the investors looking for new green projects will be able to shop around and basically see where the best conditions are. So that's part of the picture. In Europe, with this alliance, we want to ensure that we also have favorable conditions for investments in the EU. Right, so let's move to the next slide, please. So now moving to the objectives of the alliance. I already talked about it a little bit. What we want to aim at here is we have a very quantified specific target for production by 2025. That's basically, the industry, if we want to provide a certain investment certainty, the industry needs to see that there's a clear direction of travel. And what we want to achieve is 30 gigawatts of annual manufacturing capacity by 2025 across the value chain. So in the previous slide, you have seen that for polysilicon, so upstream, we already have 23. So the gap is not so big, 7. But if you look at ingots, wafers, and so on, we really have to scale up massively fast. Right, so that's the overall approach. The value chain, as I mentioned, we will target from polysilicon, wafers, ingots, all the way to modules. And I think we can move to the next slide, where I will speak about basically how we want to achieve that objective of 30 gigawatts of production across the value chain in 3 years, which is basically tomorrow. So this is an ambitious project. First, as I said, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, this is a very attractive program to the industry because there's clarity about subsidies that you're getting. Subsidies are rather generous. In Europe, we also have different financing projects. The problem with the framework here is that it's relatively complex to navigate for investors and project developers. We have programs at national level, EU level, and regional level. So we will be aiming at creating some clarity with respect to that and facilitate in that way access to finance for new projects. We also have a new source of finance. When COVID hit Europe, for the first time, Europe decided to issue joint debt on the markets and finance through that way recovery from COVID. And what we agreed to is that about 40% of that recovery will have to go to green projects. So now we are working with the relevant member states and departments of the Commission to make sure that part of that green investments from the recovery funds will also go to industrial development projects focused on the solar sector. Second element, identify manufacturing scale-up bottlenecks and provide recommendations. So that's really about how to create a more favorable regulatory frame. And I mentioned the things that Europe is doing on accelerating permitting for. Here we talk about, as I said, deployment projects. So how wind farms, notably, can be installed faster. But permitting is also an issue for manufacturing. If we want to compete with China, we really need scale. So we talk about massive manufacturing sites, the so-called gigafactories, and that also often, the procedures, the paperwork takes too much time, and investors cannot wait for that. So that's why we will also be aiming at speeding up permitting for such industrial projects. Right. Third element, provide a framework for cooperation actions for development and uptake. So here it's about matching supply and demand. And we have a success story in the EU, which is the European Battery Alliance. So 4 years ago, we have also set very ambitious objectives to develop that sector in Europe, basically from scratch. And since then, we have had a great success. So we have, I think, currently about 10 gigafactories of batteries in Europe. We have 20 that should go online in the coming months. So that's really, in a short time, you build a whole new sector. And part of that success story was to match new developers of batteries with off-takers. In that case, mainly car producers. Europe is still a powerhouse for cars. We need to car production. We need to quickly move towards electric cars production to be able to compete with notably Tesla. And, that's happening. And that's also why battery production in the EU increased. So we will try to replicate the same for solar PV, notably working with utilities, but also public authorities who, as I said, will have this obligation to install solar panels on their roofs in the coming years. Fourth element, skills. Skills are needed not only for installers, but also for working in those new production sites. And here we have rather generous EU funding programs such as the European Social Fund. What we will have to make sure is that they are really linked well to the industry needs, and we will be working to establish those links. Fifth element, circularity and sustainability. Here we come back to what I mentioned at the beginning about eco-design, the requirements that you apply to products that are placed on the EU market. And I mentioned those requirements for embedded carbon footprint for solar PVs that are expected to be adopted next year. Support to innovation and research. I think, we have, for research and innovation, we have very good programs in the EU, Horizon Europe, the Innovation Fund. We are increasing funding for solar under those programs, but we also have to be better at, going through the so-called valley of death. So often what we had for many technologies in Europe is that we were funding research and development, and when they were reaching, market readiness, then investments on that basis were happening elsewhere. So we need to have this bridge financing between between early stage research and development and then commercialization, let's say. And final point, international partnerships. I mentioned the IRA. Of course, China has its own programs. India also is deploying its programs, Canada. So there's a risk here of a, let's say, subsidy raise, but there is also an opportunity to cooperate on certain aspects, such as notably access to raw materials. And we will be trying to find space for cooperation with our partners where it makes sense. I think we can move to the last slide before moving to the Q&A. Right, so next steps. As I said, these are the broad policy lines on which we are working currently. We have a strategic partner with whom we are deploying that. We have the European industry, solar industry, that is fully on board. We want to engage also with public financiers, such as the European Investment Bank, who has a really big firepower. And with all of those stakeholders, we will have a big launch event in Brussels on the 9th of December. And here I expect this will be also on, it will be in person, but probably also online. So I, of course, invite you also to join that event. We can send you links after the event. And, you know, further to that, we will have a strategic action plan and we will deploy the plan across the dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them. Thank you. I'll also hear comments. Over to you, Jennifer, I think, right?
Exactly, yeah. Thank you very much for this insightful presentation, Jacek, and for explaining in depth the goals and the ambitions of the Alliance. Yes, so we will now open up to questions from the audience. I remind you again to pose your questions in the Slido. So a question that we received, Jacek, is on how interested organizations can participate in the work of the Solar Alliance. If you could maybe explain that a little bit.
Right. Thanks, Jennifer. So basically, I think, and please correct me or compliment Jennifer, because you are involved in the implementation even more than I am. But to my knowledge, next week, we will be going online with this initiative. We will have a dedicated website with an application form where you will be able to state your interest in joining the project. We, as I said, will have this launch event on the 9th of December in Brussels. You are welcome. On the website, you will have a reference to that. You will be able to register either online or, I suppose, or in person. And, you know, after the initiative will be properly launched and implemented, we will have different work streams. So depending on what kind of organization or company you will be, there will be space for you. So if you're an investor, we will have, for example, a matchmaking process between investors and project developers, the so-called, I think, industrial development program. If you're a research institute, we will also have a dedicated work stream to work on identifying avenues for further research on solar PV and linking that with different sources of financing provided from the EU budget, notably such as the Innovation Fund that I mentioned, but also Horizon Europe, which is this massive research and development program. And if you're a public authority, there will be also, of course, space for you, notably to work as an off-taker, you know, to work with the industry and see how you could access, or rather how you could identify the products that are most environmentally friendly, since you will have to install them on your rooftop.
Thank you very much. A question linked to that is about the launch event. There was a question asked about how we can attend the December 9 launch in Brussels.
Right. So it's work in progress, but we want this to make, we want this to be a big event, a lot of participants. So we, of course, invite you to join it. Today, I'm afraid I cannot send you the the link to the website and registration form, because this will be going online next week. But I think we can find a way, you can write either to me or to Jennifer, and, we can direct you to that next week when this will be online.
There was just a question asked, which I think you've just addressed, but just to confirm, the question said, so we understand that from your website, expected soon, we can register to attend the event in December in Brussels, correct?
Yeah, I think so. No, Jennifer?
Exactly, yeah, as you just said, it should be going online next week, and looking forward to your registrations. Then there was another comment and question regarding some problems as well some challenges. So is the fast pace of technological advance in solar and the resulting policy implications, should buyers be prevented from upgrading their panels at will to preserve critical minerals? So essentially, as solar is advancing as a technology very quickly, and creates certain policy implications, should buyers be prevented from upgrading the panels in order to preserve the critical minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges that we'll be facing in the coming years, since this deployment is really getting pace, but also we're getting to the end of the life cycle for a lot of those installations in Europe. The question is, what will we do with all that material? To what extent we will be able to recycle, reuse, and so on. And if you look at the what's happening in Europe, we have certain leading companies in the recycling of PV panels, but still their capacity is not sufficient to process all of that. So that's a very good question, and we will have to develop processes for that. And I think, part of the solution will be addressed through those product standards that I mentioned, but part of it will be about processes, putting in place processes for recycling panels that reach their end of life. And we will be working on that as well as part of the alliance. But, we have to make sure that we basically, that the durability, notably, of the panels that we install is increased, because currently often what we get on the EU market is of low quality. And that's, again, something that we'll address through those product standards, which will set not only embedded carbon requirements, but also requirements in terms of quality and durability of the panels and their recyclability.
Thank you very much for addressing that. Now I would like to read out some comments that we've received also in the chat. There were two comments regarding the strategic action plan. So one comment was, it would be good if the strategic action plan specifically addressed battery storage. And a second comment was also that the strategic action plan could also address how you will communicate with stakeholders. The public is concerned that if they install solar, that their energy use will be impacted, either by having less energy or intermittent energy. So, would you like to address these comments?
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think they are kind of linked questions, and I think there's no an easy answer, because I think if you have an industrial development program, if you want to move fast and be effective, you have to have relatively narrow objectives. So here we have this relatively narrow objective, which is to scale up production. But at the same time, as you pointed out in those comments, you cannot look at it outside of the context. And so we, of course, are aware that there are broader issues with solar PV. Currently, often, for example, the grid is not adapted sufficiently to locally installed PV. And so consumers indeed install on their rooftops solar PV, and then cannot reap the benefits from it that they expected, because their production, their feeding of the electricity to the grid is curtailed because the grid cannot support it. So we have to look at the system integration aspect also, and the battery storage that was referred to is part of the picture, of course. So I think we will have to see how we discuss this in the alliance. I would argue that we have to focus above all on this scale-up production objective, because that's where we want to go. But at the same time, indeed, the broader system integration issues, consumer acceptability are also important points. And of course, consumer organizations will, if they will be willing to take part in the alliance, they will be more than welcome.
We've received another question which asks more about the funding of the alliance. So the question is, from which EU funds and programs will the alliance be funded, and which DGs will be most involved in the development of the alliance?
Thanks for that. So basically, we have to use what we have already. So the issue with EU funds is that they are agreed for 7 years, right? And so when new initiatives come, you have to use what is already out there. But what is out there is relatively generous. So we will be aiming at, taking resources from those existing programs. I mentioned above all these post-COVID recovery funds, where, if you look at the money, currently there will be about 20 billion euros of additional funds allocated to that instrument, specifically for energy transition objectives. So we will be aiming at tapping into that 20 billion. If you look at the main innovation program for energy in the EU, which is the Innovation Fund, just now in November, at the beginning of the month, there was a first call which aims at also innovative manufacturing for clean technologies. So we are basically trying to integrate the objectives of the alliance into existing funding sources. We also have the structural funds, which will be deployed, and member states are managing those funds. Member states will be also part of the alliance. So we will be working with them to ensure that part of these funds go into industrial development projects for solar PV. And as I said, skills, also an important element. We already secured some funding for having a so-called solar academy, which will aim at developing training programs for future workers of those gigafactories for solar PV.
Many thanks for elaborating on that. We've just also received some comments which kind of tie into what's been asked before as well, with how is the alliance going to communicate with the public? And so, for example, a comment addressed that in the US, there's a company that provides customer service to the solar PV industry. So there's the need for a point of contact to the public. Especially, it has been stressed that if the public has a bad experience, they may elect politicians who are against solar. So that has been raised as an important point to also consider as part of the alliance, probably. So.
Yeah, good point. I mean, we will deploy this in full transparency. As I said, NGOs, consumer organizations will be a part of the picture if they express that wish. Absolutely.
And then we've also received a few broader comments that suggest how the EU could further increase the solar PV expansion also globally, and also in terms of the recyclability. So for the recyclability, it has been suggested that the EU could also create a solar PV recycling tax to fund new recycling and or repair facilities specifically dedicated to solar PV. Is that in terms of recyclability or recyclability tax? Is that something you like to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, interesting idea. I'm not sure it would help with the social acceptability. Consumers hate taxes, but yeah, it's more by way of a small joke. But yeah, interesting idea, worth considering. Absolutely.
And the second idea was more in a global context, that the EU should tie implementation of solar here to implementation in Africa. So for every 50,000 panels installed in the EU should offer to governments in Africa the opportunity to buy X amount or like X thousand panels at a discounted price potentially. So the EU can take advantage of bulk pricing as well.
Yeah. Now, I'm not an expert of the external dimension, so I don't want to speak about it too much, but I know that we are deploying certain wide-ranging programs to help developing countries in the energy transition. We have the so-called European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, which is deployed through notably the European Investment Bank, and a significant part of those projects is devoted to energy. Our partner there is notably the European Investment Bank. So this is, I think, one of the objectives of the EU, as far as I know, to also assist the transition in countries not located in Africa. Yeah, but I have no further comments on that.
Many thanks. Yeah. There are no more questions at the moment in the Slido. So if any of you have any more questions that you would like to raise, feel free to put them in there. So we can give it another minute or so.
All right.
Otherwise, if there are no further questions, we can slowly come to an end of the session.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so nothing's coming up at the moment. Probably you've done a very good job at explaining the alliance, Jacek, and answering all the questions. Although there was actually just one put in the chat, if you don't mind answering another one. How are we in Europe going to use the expertise and the experience of the polysilicon manufacturer in these upcoming plants?
Yes, thanks for that. I mean, yeah, this company is a well-established, indeed, manufacturer of polysilicon. They cooperate with, the paradox today is that they kind of export their products to China, and then China exports the final product to the EU. So they have a lot of experience. But, it's not only polysilicon, because I mentioned that in those other fragments of the value chain, we have small production, but we have very innovative companies across all of those elements of the value chain. Also in ingots and wafers and modules, we have companies developing things like, perovskite. So really next generation PVs. And so the whole challenge here is about scaling that up, notably to meet the demand, but also to reduce costs. So all this to say that we have top class experience in the EU that we can use. We just have to scale it up.
Thank you very much, Jacek, for taking this question as well. Yeah, so there are no more questions still. I think that means that this will then bring us to the end of the event. Yeah, I would like to thank you all very much for joining us at our EU side event during the COP27 on our upcoming European Solar PV Alliance. Is there anything you'd like to say, Jacek, as final comments or?
No, also thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that, and thank you, participants, for listening to us and asking questions. And as I said, this will be an open initiative, so please watch the space, and yeah, we will be deploying this in coming weeks.
Incredibly sorry, Jacek. There just came another question actually. Would you mind taking that as well?
Not at all.
Because we do still have a few moments. Okay, wonderful. So in the UK, consumers are paying for energy based on the oil and gas markets. Even though a significant percentage of energy comes from renewable sources, how will you ensure that the bills reflect solar pricing and not solar plus gas?
Yes, yes, this is a complex issue that indeed is an object of hot debates in the EU currently, because we have the same model basically, which where the so-called marginal pricing model, where the price for electricity is established by the marginal source of energy, which is usually gas. And this has worked very well so far, because the cost of renewables was going down so much. There was a big incentive to invest in renewables, and so the difference between the cost of generation and what you were getting from it for renewables was quite high. But in the current circumstances, I think a lot of people are arguing that the model is broken, and so the Commission is working on redesigning the current electricity market design, and there should be proposals going in that direction in early next year, to decouple that a little bit and to reflect better the cost for consumers, to link better the cost paid by the consumers to the cost of the energy source that they use. But this is a complex matter, I think, with no easy answers, but only difficult trade-offs. Yeah, the best is if you can go off grid and just have your generation yourself with your storage and so on. But for the moment, it's still an option that is technologically and cost-wise difficult for the vast majority of consumers. But we will get there one day.
Wonderful, many thanks. I think now we can actually come to an end of the session. As I said, thank you all very much for joining, and also for your engagement in the Q&A. Special thanks to you, Jacek, for the insightful and informative presentation. And of course, also many thanks to all the colleagues at COP27 for organizing this online event. Yes, as Jacek pointed out, look out for the website next week, and also for the registration to our launch event. We would all love to welcome you there, and and continue working on the European Solar PV Industry Alliance together. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us here in saying that we're looking forward to hearing much more about the Alliance in the near future and its contributions to scaling up the green energy and the solar PV value chain in Europe. This being said, I'm wishing you all a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the remaining days of COP27.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.